Hi, I'm Ted Snyder. I'm professor of economics and management at Yale School of Management. Welcome to this one of several panels on the COVID-19 crisis. This one's going to focus on global issues. I want to welcome students, prospective students, alumni, friends, faculty, staff to this session. I also want to extend a special welcome to new members of the Yale SOM community in the Broad Center. We look very much forward to your work in the educational sector. And at the beginning, I want to give a shout out to our IT and media services teams. You guys are the best. If it took the crisis for all of us to get a better sense of that, I guess that's one silver lining. So we're going to get into these global issues. I've got three great faculty colleagues to join us, and let me introduce each one of them. First, we have Amy Rezniewski, the Michael H. Jordan Professor of Management at SOM, and Amy did her graduate work at Michigan, where actually we overlapped a bit. And then she started her academic career at NYU and came to Yale SOM in 2006. Amy is an expert on how we experience work, the meaning that we derive from it or the lack thereof, and how context influences those important fundamental feelings about ourselves. Her recent publications have dealt with the agony and ecstasy of the gig economy and also on the efficacy of different types of motivation. Amy's also the person who spearheaded the development of GVT, Global Virtual Teams, a course that's required for all full-time MBAs, and it's a course that's offered to other students. And from my perspective, it's one of the features that makes SOM the best place for students to come into a program with very robust team experiences and then take those, get support, get insight, and move forward to actually becoming a sort of an extraordinary team member and leader. So Amy, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Next, I want to introduce Lorenzo Caliendo. Lorenzo is a professor of economics. He joined Yale SOM in 2011. He did his graduate work at Chicago. We also, therefore, overlapped a bit. Lorenzo is an expert on macroeconomics, international trade, migration, and spatially distinct labor markets. But he also takes that big picture framework and he applies it to individual firms and what firms pay their workers and also firm productivity. Several of his publications deal with how trade relationships affect the well-being of citizens. He's got an important paper coming out on the welfare effects of China-US. He's also done a similar inquiry into the effects of NAFTA. Lorenzo is a great scholar, teacher, and citizen of Yale and beyond. He's an affiliated member of the faculty at the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs, and he's got a secondary appointment with Yale's economics department. So Lorenzo, welcome.
Thanks so much, Ted. Thank you.
Good to see you. I see a little radical growth here.
Yes.
Good. Good to see you. And then last, I want to introduce James Levinson. Jim is the Charles W. Goodyear Professor in Global Affairs and Professor of Economics. He is the founding director of the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. He did his graduate work at Princeton, was on the faculty at University of Michigan back in the 1980s, 90s, and into the 2000s. Jim is a dear friend of mine. His decision to come to Yale in 2010 was actually very influential in my decision to follow 18 months later. Jim has deep expertise in international trade, in employment, and global enterprises. So he's a real scholar, but as director, he also runs in circles that very few people get to run in. He connects with leaders all around the world, the EU, Africa, Latin America, Asia, China, and of course, in the US. Jim, welcome. Good to have you here.
Thanks. Thank you so much for including me.
All right, so the format is I'm gonna toss the ball over to Amy and maybe throw in a little bit of framing, and then we'll go from there, and we look forward to a good conversation about global issues. Here's my take, Amy. COVID-19 is having two very different kinds of effects. One is that it's changing how people work. Maybe it's an accelerant in pre-existing trends, but it's also putting massive numbers of people out of work. And it seems like, you know, in some ways that's a tale of two cities. Some of us get to work remotely, others are getting unemployed, losing their jobs, their enterprises, their sense of self. And these are unbelievably profound. I don't know that academic research has ever dealt with shocks that are hitting this hard. Your take.
Thanks for the question. And I think it's a good one to start on, because it is what we're seeing, and what we'll see, I think, has something that's pretty unprecedented in modern times. In unemployment research in my area of work, which is organizational behavior and organizational psychology, there have been studies of societies that have been affected by massive unemployment. So let's say sort of island geographies or communities where a great percentage of that population has been put out of work. And one of the things we know is it's devastating. It's devastating to individuals, but it's also devastating to the fabric of society. If you think about what work contributes to people's ability to maintain a sense of identity, obviously pay to support their lives outside of work, but some of the more unappreciated or underappreciated contributions that work makes is to people's sort of connection to the broader society, their use of time, and so on. So when that bottoms out, you really pretty quickly come to see obviously economic and financial desperation, but also just general disorganization of the societal fabric. So this is something that's a huge worry as we watch, not just in the US, but I think this is my international expert colleagues will have more to say about this, but this is going to have differential impact across the globe. But I think it's a huge worry because unemployment is so destabilizing, both to the individual, to the group, and to the community. So that's sort of the one side of this. The other side of this, as you point out, is it's pushing trends in the move to remote work for people who remain at work. So, but I don't really want to overstate this, right? So we've been seeing a move to more and more remote work, but the latest estimate is that only 29% of US workers, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, are set up for remote work or are able to work remotely. And so what's been happening over the past few weeks is people who are not set up for this, their work isn't necessarily structured for this, right? Being forced into these kinds of arrangements because of the pandemic. So those aren't necessarily equivalent cases, but one of the things that we know about remote work is that it's kind of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, people like the flexibility. We know that from research that I've done, people are willing to forego wage premiums to stay in jobs where they're able to have more flexibility to work remotely as they choose. And we also know that people tend to have a harder time keeping a boundary between home and work when they are working remotely. And so we get a lot of reports of people working more than they would if they were commuting into an office. But on the other side, we know that people experience a sense of disconnection from others, from their teams, from basically the core of the workplace itself, particularly the more they work remotely. And so one of the interesting findings that, that is in this literature on remote work is that the more remote people are, the less identified they are with their organizations, the higher their eventual intent to turn over, and so on. And so I think, you know, this is something we're starting to see. I think the appetite, the ceiling of the appetite that people have for being all remote all the time. And so on the positive side of that, I would say it's a test case for maybe resistant managers to see just how much work can get done remotely, which is a good thing. But I don't know that I'm hearing a whole lot of clamoring for people now suddenly wanting to work remotely 100% of the time. I think if anything, we're realizing that some hybrid might be, when possible, perhaps best.
So could I follow up? Just, I find this percentage that you cited very interesting. Only 29% are really set up to work remotely. And then we've got, you know, we'll probably pass 15% unemployment next week or the following week. And so that's quite a contrast. But there's a, you know, we're educators, we're committed to our students,
Yeah.
our alumni. There are also students who are not getting any traction with their job search. So I'm curious, is there anything in the literature that deals with that phenomenon, which I think is also important right now?
Of searching in an environment like this?
Yeah, when you can't search.
When you can't search. Yeah, I mean, I think, again, we're very much on, you know, in uncharted waters here with this. I had a discussion with some of our current students right now about a week ago, and this is a huge concern for them. And the contrast that came out of that conversation was the fact that a time like this focuses people on thinking about the work that they're doing or the work that they want to do, and to think, is this actually work that matters to me? That's a good thing, in my opinion, given the kinds of things I study. But that is bumping up against the very hard reality of people realizing that the kind of thing they wanted to do might not be as practical or as available now. And so you're seeing students really worrying, and people in job searches really worrying about where will the industries be that are in a stronger position coming out of this, whether or not they're necessarily interested in them, so that they can direct a search in that direction. And so that's a question I'd put to my colleagues on the panel about where, you know, where might those opportunities continue to exist or be, you know, growing.
Well, thank you. Let me now turn to Lorenzo and pick up on Amy's metaphor about the fabric of societies being pulled and stretched and challenged. It turns out that, you know, economists like you, Lorenzo, probably studied David Ricardo's stuff. David Ricardo, 203 years ago, wrote his famous work on comparative advantage. Ironically, he died of sepsis, an infection that caused inflammation and over-response of his immune system to some kind of infection, whether it was bacterial or viral. But you know, as economists, we say, well, it's about comparative advantage. The world will go on. But it raises the question, well, who's going to become more advantaged, and which societies and what drivers of comparative advantage will be more relevant going forward? And will it be, for example, your home country of Chile, a small open economy, or will it be Northern European countries that are part of the EU? Will it be, you know, one of Jim's areas of expertise, a country like South Africa, the most developed country on the continent? So I'm just curious to get some overall comments from you, Lorenzo, on how do you see the relationships and the positions of countries changing as we go forward into this completely new world?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. I think it's a very important, very difficult question, actually. Now, I don't think there are winners in a pandemic, since all human beings are in fact susceptible to it. Yet, even in this case in which all countries are basically exposed to the same shock, this health shock, and where countries have not actually prepared for this, countries have not actually done investments to deal with this situation, we might still see very heterogeneous effects. So I think it's more about these differential effects, I think, who loses more compared to others. So related to comparative advantage, let me basically emphasize on three big aspects why I think we might actually see very heterogeneous effects. One has to do with the fact that from scientists, the policy prescription to this situation is in fact to separate the susceptible from the infected, what we actually been calling social distancing. Now, by doing so, countries will be able to slow down, as we know, the rate of propagation of this disease and gain in terms of time. Time to do what? Time to increase their medical capabilities and equipment, and time for a vaccine to be developed. Now, the way in which countries are increasing this social distances actually varies. From complete lockdown, in some countries, in fact, this is a forced lockdown, to partial lockdown. Some countries are actually decided to lock down basically the most vulnerable population. But for some countries, complete lockdown is completely unfeasible. So the first problem that some countries are facing, different to others, is how to gain time, social distancing without lockdown. And given that countries are basically choosing different heterogeneous policies to do this, because we cannot follow the same policy across countries, we're gonna actually see heterogeneous effects. The second aspect where I do think that we're also gonna see some heterogeneous effects, and this relates much more to my research and what you were emphasizing, it's a problem that countries are facing is how to scale up the production of tests and medical equipment fast. And what we have actually observed is that in the last month is what countries have been doing is basically reducing import restrictions of medical equipment, ventilators, masks, and so on. And as we know, some countries over the years have specialized, and that's where Ricardo comes in, on the production of these equipment. So, but the challenge that actually the importing countries are facing is that the exporters are imposing export restrictions on some of this equipment. And these restrictions, the argument of these restrictions are mostly based on protecting their citizens, and because they are not able to scale up the production fast. So going back to this particular problem, which how do we scale up this production very fast? So here we also see some heterogeneous effects, where it's like, to some extent, those countries which are not getting access to this medical equipment are going to actually have a different outcome compared to those that actually get access very fast. Finally, let me focus on the three aspects where I do see that potentially countries can have very different effects. It has to do with the fact that, well, we know that countries have not invested for this rare event, right? It's not the case that the world and no country was prepared for something like this. Still, I do think that we have an opportunity to prepare what is going to be needed when the vaccine arrives. Similar to the point that I actually made before, countries have comparative advantage also on research and development. Countries today, we know, countries have comparative advantage in the production of millions of vaccines. In fact, millions of vaccines are produced every year. Now, and it's very likely that the vaccine is going to be developed in one of these countries, the countries that actually have a comparative advantage. And we're talking about a handful of countries. So I think the challenge here is going to be then how to scale up the production very fast. So whenever this vaccine arrives, how are we able to scale up the production without crowding out the production of other vaccines, of course. And so that's something we can start actually investing today. And the challenge is to scale up this production and basically reach out to every single country of the world, also because of trade. So to the extent, going back to your point, so I don't see winners, but I see that to the extent in which countries are following different policies to mitigate and basically to achieve social distancing, to the extent in which countries are facing different production and trade barriers for medical equipment, and potentially facing different barriers to access to a vaccine in the future, yes, I think we're going to see very different heterogeneous effects, and some countries actually, in fact, losing more compared to others.
Thank you. So let me follow up, Lorenzo. I appreciate what you're saying. No winners. How could there be? On the other hand, you're saying heterogeneous effects across countries, and I personally hadn't thought about the R&D issue. So, you know, as you mentioned, it's a relative handful of countries that do that. I guess another effect that I had been thinking about a little bit is just the energy sector. And what we're seeing is that the price of carbon is going, you know, pretty darn close to zero. And we may have a longer term effect on the use of carbon, travel for both personal and business purposes, less shipping, who knows what. But is that something that we should pay attention to in terms of who's going to benefit and who's going to get hurt, relatively speaking?
I think it's a very good question, Ted. I think something that we're going to actually learn from this event. We're going to learn a lot of things, a lot of elasticities, which are very difficult to estimate for economists. So, for instance, to what extent we, in fact, carbon emissions done generated by countries in the activities that countries pursue. But at this time, I think the main issue is to deal with this health problem. So in the short run, I think all countries seem to be emphasizing on trying to solve this health problem to eventually come back to where we were before. Now, are we going to the same place compared to where we were before? I think that will depend. That will depend on what we learn during this process. And we might learn, kind of what you were saying, that reducing certain activities might actually be beneficial for the world. But I think at this stage it's too early to know. I think the main issue today is to focus on trying to solve this problem and eventually learn from this exogenous shock.
Great, thank you. So Jim, I'm tempted not to ask any question because you know, I could just toss the ball over, but you know, maybe you would want to comment and add further insights to what Lorenzo said about comparative advantage and which countries do you see as coming out of this relatively strongly and others not so much?
Sure.
But also, I think I have to ask you about China and the US, because in your role as director of the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs, you deal with that G2 relationship all the time. And there's a lot of consternation and reevaluation of the view that China and the US are sort of natural economic partners, even though there's tension and rivalry. So I'd be interested in, you know, both lines of thought, just what's happening across countries, as Lorenzo said, effects across countries will be different for a variety of reasons, but also if you could focus on the G2.
Thanks, Ted. Lorenzo highlighted the issue of comparative advantage, and you teed it up a little bit that way too, with your reference to Ricardo and his untimely demise. I think that it is really important as we think through which countries are likely to suffer less, is probably the best way to put it. There aren't winners, as you noted. At some level, everybody's a loser. But while three of the four of us are PhD economists, I think one of the things that is going to be highlighted as we look at the experiences across different countries is not economic at all. I think it's the quality of leadership matters. And one of the lessons that I'm observing anyway is that that quality of leadership is not dependent on any particular form of government. We've seen a very effective response to the crisis in a very authoritarian country like China. We've seen a very effective response in sort of a hybrid type of situation in Singapore. We've seen a country like Germany, quite democratic, also a very effective response. All of those are characterized, I think, by, at some level, very effective leadership. I think that the situation we are struggling with in this country also reflects a dearth of quality leadership. So as we think through what is going to differentiate countries, sure, economic issues, the fact that some countries have a comparative advantage in research, others don't. Yeah, those matter, but I wouldn't want to forget what I think is probably an even more important factor, which is quality of leadership. So I'd throw that out there. It doesn't fit nicely into economics, but I think if we're going to try to understand why, Amy asked, or in your conversation with Amy, you're asking, where do you look for jobs? Look for jobs in Korea and Singapore. I've been on phone calls with folks in both of those countries over the last couple days, and it was described as sort of 80% back to normal. I don't know if that's right, but they're way ahead of the curve relative to things here. And again, that probably has as much to do with effective leadership as anything else. So I would throw those out there. US, China, my gosh, it's complicated. Without getting into too many details, and I don't want to use personal pronouns, but leadership matters there too. The United States is would love to get, I think, the supply chain working well, the global supply chain. I don't think it'll ever go back to quite the way it was before. I think a number of key countries realize that there are certain strategic goods for which international interdependence is, they're not willing to risk it. And that's okay. In terms of the big picture, will international trade and global supply chain go back to where it was? Maybe not all the way, but I'd love to hear what Lorenzo thinks. But I think in time, we'll probably get 80, 90, 95% of the way back there, with the difference being a few key strategic sectors. So I'd throw those ideas out there. See what others think.
Excellent. Thank you, Jim. It just makes so much sense that you would be attentive to this issue of leadership across countries. And I'd like to invite I think we have something close, 185 participants, and invite people to pose questions in the chat. And I will try to toss them up to various people on the panel. And so please submit questions. But before we turn to questions, maybe I'd just like to hear what the panelists think of what has been posed to this point. I think this idea of fabric of society being challenged is something that Amy introduced, and I think, Jim, you're saying that leadership's going to play an important role in how that social fabric stays intact or not. Amy, Lorenzo, Jim, any comments on what you've heard to this point?
I have some reactions to this, because I think the comment is spot on that leadership is going to be crucial, and we're seeing enormous differences play out already in a variety of countries that have taken very different stances to communicating with their citizens and framing what it is that's called for and necessary and why, versus sending confusing signals to the point of sending no signal perhaps at all. And this is, I think, overlaid on an interesting difference between countries, which is to say, you can look at the cultural differences between countries across the globe. And my colleague, Michelle Gelfand, at the University of Maryland, soon to be at Stanford, has developed a whole research career studying the tightness or looseness of cultures. And we know that a variety of countries have sort of tighter cultures, which is to say they are more rule-bound, they are more less autonomous, they have more use of rules, punishments, monitoring, and so on, and are comfortable with this, versus countries like the US that are much looser with respect to the culture, much more individualistic. You tend to get upsides like, you know, creativity and entrepreneurial behavior rather, but you also tend to get much more egocentric behavior and resistance to having rules, you know, put on you. And so that creates already more or less of an easy time with instituting the kinds of changes that have had to be introduced with respect to the pandemic in terms of, you know, social distancing, people's movement, and so on. And so what I would say is in countries that are looser, what then becomes required is exactly to Jim's point, is excellent leadership that is able to frame a message for the population about why it is that, you know, perhaps the loose way that we had been is not going to help us fight against some threat like a pandemic. So we know it's possible. If you look at World War II in the US, it's possible for a loose culture to get tighter sort of in the face of a threat. But I think, you know, there's a moment that has to be seized in order to be successful from the health outcome perspective in framing the right kind of message and doing it consistently. And I think that juxtaposition of what's already in place culturally and then what's happening on the leadership side is going to do a lot to predict the health outcomes that Lorenzo was discussing and the importance of leadership that Jim has highlighted. So
Lorenzo, is there anything based on your review of the literature on strength of economies that deals with this issue of social fabric in times of crisis? Or is that just simply beyond the scope of what economists study? And is it more in the political science realm?
No, some economists definitely study these issues. But let me comment on what Amy and Jim said, if you don't mind. So I think one number that Amy said is very important, the fact that 29% of the workforce in the US can in fact work from home. So related to these heterogeneous effects that you were saying before, this is very different across economies, as you might imagine, and this is very correlated with income levels. In developing countries, this is not the case, not even close. In a country like Singapore and South Korea, the numbers are very similar to the US. There's a recent study actually showing across economies this year. So that's one thing. The second thing I would like to relate to Jim is, yes, crisis management, leadership seems to matter a lot. I'm not an expert, but that seems to be quite related to the resources that countries have in hand. I think the crisis management of a developing country, they're struggling with very different issues compared to the issues of a country like Singapore or South Korea. In fact, I think Singapore started a complete lockdown a couple of weeks ago. And when they were the reference country, which you're right, people were actually working, they continue not locking down for several weeks. And we were looking at that as an example to follow, but eventually end up with a lockdown. Lockdown, it's possible to the extent that the country has savings, but for countries that actually rely on foreign debt, in fact, countries today are basically defaulting on their debt. Argentina basically told the IMF we're not being able to pay for 3 or 4 years. So I think leadership, of course, matters. I think this is a time of crisis management, but I think the issues that countries are facing are very, very different. So in that sense, we should not only look at developed countries when we're looking at leadership. Second point related to this is usually when I don't know, so the history has shown us that usually when there have been like these aggregate shocks, at the end countries have come together to generate this, if you want, institutions, global institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and World Organizations. Usually this happens in a moment of global need. And usually that's with leadership. In fact, the US was a big leader when that actually happened back in the day. And I guess maybe Jim is related to this. Which are going to be the groups of countries? Who's going to be the leader looking for, after we finish all this, I'm thinking about how do we avoid or how do we prepare together for something like this? And maybe it will not come from the US. I think the election at the end of the year is going to matter for that. Yes, sorry, maybe you want to continue.
So Jim, before we go to questions, do you have a comment?
Sure. I think Lorenzo raises really, really good points. I find the possible impact of this crisis on densely populated developing countries potentially just catastrophic. Truly, truly terrifying. Social distancing it's impossible. Keeping people in place if you're living, in a tin shack and it's 80, 90 degrees, it's not going to work. So there is a sense in which some of the policies that have proven effective, independent of type of leadership, are simply infeasible in large parts of the world. And yeah, it's terrifying, both on the human scale and what it may portend for the social fabric. So, while things may be leveling off in some of the richer parts of the world, it's very unclear how this plays out up the road. And Lorenzo, thank you for pointing that out. You're absolutely right.
I'll just, the way I think about this, which may be right or wrong, is that within the set of countries that have the capability of developing and implementing policies, you're seeing differences based on approach and leadership. But I think what I'm hearing you say is that those differences, while they'll be important, they may be relatively small when it comes to what we see with densely populated, less developed countries where leadership and policy execution are not going to be all that important. It's just going to be devastating.
I hope we don't see that, but I worry a lot about it. Yeah.
Well, we're getting a lot of questions, and one of which I think is relevant to how we see work across labor markets. And this bears on the question of whether countries will continue to allow immigration. It's also important for our school as to whether or not prospective students will be able to get visas and come to Jackson or SOM or so on and so forth. And I don't know I have no idea what to expect. I've been in contact with some deans of other business schools, and I'm not going to identify who, but they see this as both a challenge and an opportunity. A lot of US schools have invested in global relationships. That's going to be harder to stay the course, but if you, quote, double down, there are likely to be very positive results over time. So maybe this gets a little bit into management of US schools, but Jim, how do you see this? Because after all, you're the School of Global Affairs.
Yeah, I don't see the upside that you see. I see headache after headache after headache. In terms, students, of course, are very concerned about visa issues, about being, at one level, are they going to be able to get here? Once they're here, what will be the OPT and CPT programs? And how do those play out? My understanding is that the answer to the visa issue is likely to be very region or even country specific. Consulates will open, as I understand it, now consulates will open as circumstances on the ground dictate, and those circumstances are going to differ. Furthermore, some countries are going to have huge backlogs and others much less so. So it's going to be hard to generalize. But I think the visa issue, certainly as the head of Jackson, is something we're keeping a very close eye on.
So do you see this as, you know, if we take the flattening the curve period, giving way to a between period when we start to do things, but we don't have a vaccine, and then we have a third period post-vaccine. So are you pretty pessimistic, therefore, about this between period, that we just will not have students coming from outside the US generally until we get a vaccine?
No, I don't. I don't know. I very much hope we are not in that space. I don't anticipate being in that space, but making predictions along those lines is far enough out of my lane that I'm going to back off. I don't know.
Okay, here's another question for that relates to this fabric. If the impact of the pandemic on the global workforce is so profound, what are the implications for people who try to move into becoming gig workers, contract workers versus traditional employment? Amy, we've seen this trend towards gig work, contract work, but what if it just becomes instead of a trend, just a mass movement into a very different way to organize work?
It's a great question. I think I see two countervailing sentiments on this. On the one hand, you see a lot of attention happening in the media and in the public in the US and elsewhere too, that people who are doing the jobs that are now defined as essential workers in healthcare and transportation and so on, people clamoring for them to have better employment contracts and more security and higher pay and so on, which sort of moves against kind of more of a disconnected labor model. And at the same time, I'm slightly more sort of pessimistic about the long run effects, because I think that anytime there's going to, be this kind of destabilization of a society and its economy and so on, I worry that employers will become much less willing to take on what's involved in long-term labor contracts and so on, which may end up forcing many more people into gig economy type work. Which comes with its own challenges, as we know, from the point of view of how is it that people are going to access the kinds of benefits and the kinds of safety nets that they need that have traditionally been tied to more traditional employment.
Do you think that Amy, do you think that it's more in the hands of individuals and teams and enterprises and CEOs and directors of various organizations to come up with effective rules in this, what I call the between period? Or is it more up to government? This is a very sort of politically charged question right now, but I'll just maybe add some grist to the mill here. I don't really understand how governments can figure this out. Governments can provide guidance and they can provide infrastructure, but if I'm going to go apply for a job and work for you, there's going to be so many factors that only you and I can decide. So if we're going to be in this year or 18-month period, I just don't know how it's supposed to work.
Yeah, I want to invoke Jim's line from before about wanting to be sure to stay in my lane, with this. It's a tough question, and I share your concern, around, is government in a position to do this versus is this something that gets, worked through between employees or workers and the platforms or employers for which they're working. And I think that's frankly, I'm worried that it will be a mess. There's so much uncertainty. I think it's hard to overstate the impact of that uncertainty on everything, including the kinds of contractual relationships that employers are going to be willing to enter into, because they want to be sure to limit their own exposure to downside, not knowing how many resurgences of this virus will we see, how well are the mitigation efforts going to work, and so on. So it's a pessimistic answer, but it's kind of where I'm at. I don't know that this ends up reshaping sort of employment in ways that I'm very excited about.
Okay, here's a question that I'm going to throw to Lorenzo. We've got forces in place that are going to maybe favor protectionism. There are also going to be forces that may generate new trade relationships. There's also potential need for the development of new multilateral institutions and arrangements across countries. It could go in all kinds of different directions. Based on your knowledge of the development of these kinds of institutions and the way that countries react to this kind of economic shock, do you expect countries to retreat or engage, and if so, how?
It's a great question and a very difficult question to answer. I think the issue is there's too much uncertainty. We really don't know. We don't know the duration of this. We don't even know things like the propagation rate. Of this disease. We don't even know the right death, if you want, ratio. So there's so much uncertainty, and in such an uncertainty environment, certain environment, leaders are so focusing so much on trying to solve their problems, and they're not thinking about international cooperation, which at the end of the day seems to be what seems to matter, right? It's difficult not to think that the way to solve this problem is basically by coordinating across countries. And because at the end of the day, even if you are a country that solves this issue, let's say in terms of the health, if other countries don't solve it, you're going to get exposed to a new wave. So I don't know. I don't know the answer to your question, Ted. I think it will really depend on how fast we are able to get over this. So going back to the point of the vaccine, and I'm curious to see what Jim thinks about this, because it really depends on, I think, on leadership. Yeah.
Jim, let me reframe the question a little bit for you. What would be an example of bad economic policy coming out of this at the national level?
Well, protection in the pharmaceutical industry sounds pretty stupid to me.
Say more. Tell us what you really think.
You're asking for bad ideas. I'm a little more used to being asked for what might be a good idea. The list of bad ideas, the universe of bad ideas is infinite. Lorenzo raised a really good point. Cooperation, trade, international R&D, sharing of knowledge, the benefits of that have never been higher. And if it takes this crisis to highlight that, that's unfortunate, but we need that kind of cooperation right now. The world needs that kind of cooperation. So there's an extent to which protectionism on that particular margin would just be disastrous. And I do worry about countries setting the stage by antagonizing one another that makes that outcome, which, as I say, I think would be disastrous, probably a little more likely than it should be. It's the time to try to cooperate. Prior to the advent of this crisis, U.S.-China trade relations were pretty bad, and that's not a political statement. They were leaders on both sides of the aisle were fairly protectionist against China with different tones, but nobody was out there advocating for a free trade agreement. or anything even close. And I think, you know, Lorenzo highlighted this, but I think that the need for that kind of cooperation and, you know, if the vaccine or treatments end up coming from China, from India, from Western Europe, who knows, but having an open system by which those advances can be shared globally is just essential.
So I'm checking another question. This is from a faculty colleague whom I will not name, in part because I'm going to change the question a little bit for Amy. But if you think about the fundamental relationship between employer and employee, you know, in some cases that's governed by collective bargaining. Sometimes it's at-will contract. There are all kinds of implicit dimensions of those relationships that are under stress right now. What would be advice for the employer side? What would be advice for the employee side?
So in terms of thinking about advice that I would give, you know, from the point of view of structuring this next period, would be, you know, to the extent possible for, and this is going to sound like, you know, I think pretty intuitive advice, but to the extent possible for employers, the more transparent they can be with employees about what is possible in the structure of those employment relations and what would change it from an economic perspective and what the plans are for sort of handling that, would be, in my opinion, sort of in a crisis period, the wisest investment they could make. The amount of paranoia and sort of bad faith action sort of happening in organizations that feel like their employers are not actually being honest with them about what is happening or what is coming is difficult. For employees, I worry, you know, from the structure of employment relations that, you know, the ability to organize or sort of advocate for, you know, additional protections is not good in a period like this. And I worry will be even more undermined if employment begins to move again into more casual arrangements as time goes on. But, you know, advice for employees would be at this time to figure out, you know, how best to partner with an employer to solve the problem that is the most pressing one it's facing. Both because that's good for the employer's survival, but you know, as things maybe even out, it sets up the best possible situation for that employee.
Thank you. Maybe it sounds a little parochial, but we are concerned about our students, our prospective students, our alumni, and this is not a global issue necessarily, but we have students all over the globe. Amy, do you have any advice for the people who are really frustrated right now, not getting traction?
So in work environments specifically, yeah. I mean, I think yeah, I'm talking with them all day long. It turns out, you know, I think that the best that can happen is that, you know, if you're managing a team and you're finding that, you know, things are not sort of structured around you in a way that leads to anything but frustration, to do everything you can to essentially block and tackle for your team to create sort of a microcosm of support and ability to try to get the work done has been, I think, time-tested advice to try to sort of handle a tough situation like this. And I think for people who are sort of frustrated in their own work, you know, one of the things that is true is I think there's potentially additional degrees of freedom afforded to many people right now in their working situations because everyone's so distracted with what's happening, that it's an opportunity to think about what are the tasks and relationships that, if you were to focus on those, bring you the most benefit from the point of view of the impact you think you're having on others, and that you're able to involve yourself in efforts that bring to you more of a sense of meaning in the work that you're doing, and to use those opportunities to bring more sort of benefit to yourself, but also to the enterprise for which you work.
So one more follow-up question, Amy, on how do people stay motivated? You've studied sources of motivation and meaning. I mean, is there anything different about a crisis period where you say you should really shift the focus to a certain type of plan or approach?
So we know that, if you're looking at motivation over time, that there's great benefit in connecting with the intrinsic or sort of at base, purpose of what it is that you're doing in the work, as opposed to things that activity throws off, whether that's recognition or pay or, rewards or things like that. Those things matter, but motivation tends to be best served by feeling a deep connection to the actual product or benefit that comes from doing the work itself. The other thing that I would say, and this is based on ongoing work I'm doing with a colleague at the school, is that people who sustain much higher levels of satisfaction with the work that they're doing over time tend to think about their work as being defined as an opportunity to help other people, whether those are helping professions or not. It could be really any kind of work that you're doing. And something I've been struck by is I've heard from many colleagues and alumni as well that over this period that they feel best when they're focused on being engaged in efforts that are going to be helpful to other people, particularly in the sense of this crisis. And I think that's probably pretty good advice for a situation like the one that we're in.
Thank you. So in the couple minutes that we have left, I think I'll ask for a round of comments from each of you, and maybe we can go in reverse order. And Jim, do you have any final thoughts as we wrap up?
Nothing new. I've really enjoyed listening to Lorenzo and Amy's insights to this. The questions have been great. I look forward, I hope, to those students who are logged in, who will be coming to SOM. I look forward to being able to meet you in person.
Lorenzo.
Yes, let me agree with Jim. I think this was great. Thanks to you, Ted. Thanks to you, Amy and Jim. Let me say to the students that from our side, we are innovating in the way we teach. You see my board on the back. We're innovating the examples that we can give, innovating the experience that you might actually have if you join us next year for prospective and for current students now. I do see a brighter side of all this, but it might take time for that to happen. In the meanwhile, I think innovating as much as you can to work from home, innovating as much as you can, and take this, I know it's hard to say, as an opportunity for some. But thanks again for this discussion. I think was been very useful for me. Definitely hope it was useful for all of us.
Amy.
I'll echo my colleagues' comments. This has been a wonderful discussion, and I've learned a lot and appreciate the great questions. I very much look forward to engaging with our future students and with our current students when we're able to be together again. And I'll just tie up on one final thought, which is in times of threat, groups, whether those be countries, organizations, what have you, tend to cluster together, kind of tighten up their boundaries. They're not as cooperative with others, unless in the face of a superordinate threat that the only way to overcome it is to cooperate across those boundaries. And so I think keeping that in mind to try to increase the levels of cooperation and collaboration, whether organizationally, nationally, or societally, is perhaps our best strategy going forward.
Great. Well, I would like to thank each of you. This is my hand-picked panel, and I think when one gets older in one's academic careers, you think about people, and it's just been great. I've had a long connection with each of you, and it's borne fruit today throughout the conversation. So thank you. I think
you.
the 29% is going to stick with me. I don't have complete thoughts on it, but you know, I don't know if you've heard it, but I've heard it. I think, you know, a lot of people are focusing on that, and that's really important. People who can work from home, how that's going to change society. But there's another big chunk of people out there who aren't in that 29% by definition. And in some ways, this is a very sobering conversation for me. But out of challenge comes opportunity, and I hope we'll be able to work well together going forward. And I want to thank, we've had a great group of participants. I think it peaked around 185. Thank you for joining us. And I know I speak on behalf of the panel that we wish you well as things can be going forward during this crisis. So thank you. Bye-bye.